I don't know how Al Ewing did it, but he made a Thor comic that is simultaneously good and bad. So when I first saw that Al Ewing was going to be helming the new Thor run, I was pretty apprehensive at first. I'm not the biggest fan of Al Ewing. I don't really care for how he's been restructuring and recontextualizing the cosmic hierarchy of the Marvel Universe, which is something that he's been doing very diligently for the past few years. But after I saw some comments he made in an interview where he talked about how he really cared about the quality of the Thor run and how it was something of a challenge for him to do better as a writer than he's ever done before. That won me over a little bit, especially considering how the last run of Thor went, which I felt like it started off strong with Donny Cates doing the Galactus and the Black Winter thing, but then it fell apart from there, and not just because he couldn't finish his run due to his personal problems he had in his life. I thought the Donald Blake run kind of sucked. The arc where he tried to get his parents to reconcile was fairly boring, although I did think that Odin looked cool as an old biker. And then the God of Hammer storyline on paper should have been really interesting, but it was very underwhelming. And then I didn't read the Banner of War story because I didn't care for the gigantic robotic Hulk idea, which was also written by Donny Cates. And then, of course, the run was ended by another writer whose name I can't remember, but it tied into the Thanos Death Note story, which again on paper sounded incredibly interesting, but the execution was incredibly underwhelming. If you think about them adding more lore to the Marvel Universe and involving Thanos and Thor's grandfather Bor, sounded really interesting, but it just wasn't. Now let's go through the first issue of Thor and talk about the good and the bad. First off, I love the Alex Ross cover. He never fails to disappoint, and in fact, I think he's only gotten better over the years. Now, I did say that I don't really care for Al Ewing restructuring the mythology and cosmic hierarchy of the Marvel Universe, but I do appreciate his love for mythology in this issue of Immortal Thor. So the story starts off reminding you that there are 10 realms of Asgard, which, as an aside, is something that I never liked. I never understood the point of adding the Heaven realm and the angels. It just seemed like a weird choice. But Al Ewing's narration through this issue is interesting. It really plays into the Norse mythology and the way that Thor comics used to be written back in the day, and it's something I really enjoy about it. Unfortunately, the actual dialogue for Thor is not very consistent. So the story introduces us to these dark gods who are going to be the enemy of at least this story arc, and then immediately after the first page, the story switches over to either Asgard or Jotunheim, where there are some frost giants being led by a frost giant mage named Skrimir, and he calls himself the Utgard Loki, which is actually a title held by a different god who we'll see at the end of the issue, but he's fighting against the Warriors 4. I don't know how long that's been the case. They were the Warriors 3 for about 60 years, but I guess since it's 2023, the team needed a girl. So Thor shows up with this kind of creepy, off-putting smile. And this part seemed a little goofy at first because even though it seems like he's talking to the giants, it turns out he's actually telling the storm that he's disappointed in it. And so it disappears. So I thought, okay, that's kind of cool. And then he faces off against Skrimir and kills him. And it's like, okay, so there was that one off-putting shot with him smiling, but now he's back to his old self killing frost giants. Then Loki shows up. And look how weird his face is. This new design for Loki is also somewhat off-putting. With the lipstick, he looks like he's mocking cross-dressers or something. This is weirder than when he was possessing the body of Sif and was actually going around as a woman. I don't know why, but this version of him just makes me laugh. So basically, he's given up his role as the king of Jotunheim, and so he just shows up after this battle and brushes it all off like it's no big deal. And the weird part is that Thor just goes along with it. Thor's just like, oh yeah, that's what that Loki scamp does. Just, whatever, let's just move on. And as I was reading that, I thought, no, why is Thor acting like Loki wasn't a villain for decades? That he didn't stab his mother, that this guy constantly goes back and forth between being a villain and a hero, and yet somehow Thor hasn't had him locked up in Asgard. It doesn't make sense to me. I want to go back to the days when Loki was a villain. I think it was about a decade ago when they decided to change Loki because they thought he was getting kind of boring by just revolving around the same story repeatedly, where he's a villain and tries to trick Thor and do some villainous things. But now they're doing the exact same thing. They just have a different version of Loki because he's still a trickster. But he'll do an evil thing and pretend like, oh, I just couldn't defy my own nature. And then he'll ask for Thor's forgiveness at the end of the story arc and try to be a hero and be by Thor's side. And then in the next story arc, he's a trickster again. And he's like, oh, I can't believe I have to do this. I just keep going along with my own nature. And it's like he's doing the same story repeatedly like he used to, except this is a less interesting version of Loki. But the real reason Loki showed up is because, of course, he just happens to have a magical stick that he can use to rebuild the Bifrost out of nowhere. And Thor's like, oh, that's cool. And once again, he has a very weird facial expression. It's weird because the way he talks to villains is fine. It's how he talks around his friends and Loki that's weird. He says things like, yet it seems as fragile as spun glass, as fragile as joy. Ha ha ha. Oh, now the brooding is done, Sif. Now my heart is light again. It's like Thor is an LMD, or he's a bizarro Thor, to use a DC concept. Right after Loki built the bridge, he's like, oh, I'm so sorry, Thor. So he's doing the thing again, where he tries to do something good, and he's like, I have to give in to my nature and follow fate or whatever, and he just disappears. And Thor says, he's gone as suddenly as they came, and this troubles me. Like, oh, really? The guy who's been tricking you for years and tried to kill your friends is somehow troubling because he built a bridge out of nothing and then disappeared. Maybe you should have thought of that beforehand. So Thor flies off to Midgard, again with the creepy smile. He hangs out with some people, he fights some crime, and again, I like the narration by Al Ewing, but then he has Thor go into this weird monologue where it's basically a bunch of exposition. I guess to catch you up on the Thor story up to this point, but it's weird because he's just standing there talking to himself in a way that, to Al Ewing, I'm sure it sounds poetic and deep, but it's just very weird. And this is when the real villain shows up, and this is the Utgard Thor, Taranos. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but he considers himself to be the quote-unquote real Thor. I gotta say, this is one of the coolest designs that I've ever seen for a Marvel villain. Ironically, this almost looks like something that Donny Cates would have had in his run, but maybe it's actually something left over and Al Ewing just decided to use it. But this guy has a greater ability to wield lightning and thunder than Thor himself, despite the fact that Thor is now the Allfather and that he has the Odin Force. So they fight, and again, Thor's dialogue when he's fighting an enemy works fine, and he actually sounds like Thor. Although he displays this weird lightning power thing where it sort of covers certain aspects of his body with light, and it doesn't really make sense compared to how he did the same attack in the past, but it still looks good, and it matches the illustration by Alex Ross on the cover. And then we get to the mastermind behind whatever this plot is going to end up being, which is Utgard Loki. So that guy, the frost giant Skrimir calling himself Utgard Loki was obviously a fake. He was just taking on the name. This is the real one, and I guess there are like primordial versions of the Asgardian gods, and somehow Gaia, who is one of the primordial elder gods of Marvel, somehow she's related to them, which is weird because this recontextualizing of the mythology of Marvel, it used to be there were like 3 or 4 known elder gods and Gaia was one of them. Obviously these guys weren't part of that pantheon, but Al Ewing decided to create some new Asgardian gods. So Al Ewing is promising a story arc where Thor is now comfortable in his place as the Allfather of Asgard. He has to face primordial Norse gods, and somehow the regular Loki is involved, possibly against his will, and the Utgard Loki is the one controlling it all for some reason. Gaia is involved, and keep in mind that Gaia is Thor's biological mother. I am interested in seeing where this goes, although I am slightly concerned that Al Ewing will do the same thing that Donny Cates did, which is start right off the bat with a huge story arc that seems like it's going to change everything, and then drop the ball afterward. And you'll see the story just gets kind of more and more into an underwhelming, overarching story arc. So at the end of the issue, Al Ewing writes a letter to the audience talking about how he grew up liking Thor, about the different things he likes about Thor, and one of those things is that he says, I like him best when he smiles. I hope you do too. Obviously, that's the reason why Thor is smiling so much in the comic. But it also made me think of something, and that's Barney the dinosaur from the children's show. The way that Thor robotically smiles in that weird way and how he talks around his companions reminds me of the very robotic way that Barney the dinosaur smiles with those dead eyes and that creepy smile. And obviously it's a dude in a suit pretending to be friendly with children. It's an act. I can't help feeling the same thing when I see this version of Thor. Like, when he talks to his enemies, it's okay, but the writing isn't consistent, so when he talks to his friends, it's just very off-putting, and if it turned out that Loki was controlling Thor's mind, I wouldn't be surprised. But hopefully Al Ewing is done with the exposition, so we don't get weird monologues anymore. Hopefully he writes Thor more consistently because, again, the way he talks with his friends is weird, and the monologues where he says things like, "Oh yes, this is my hammer Mjolnir, it is mine. I am the Allfather, that is a fact. I'm no longer struggling with my identity despite changing my costume back to the Silver Age version," which Al Ewing has not bothered to explain. And then with the whole Loki thing, I wish he'd go back to being a villain, and I think his appearance now is really goofy, and I feel like Al Ewing wrote the Warriors 3 to kind of go out of their way to compliment him, even though it's not something they would ever care about, because they're the Warriors 3 and he's a villain. So that's what I mean when I said this is simultaneously good and bad. I think the narration is good, I think the mythology is interesting, and I'm interested to see where it goes with the primordial Norse gods. The writing for Thor himself is very inconsistent, and I really hope the artist, kind of as he goes along, learns how to draw Thor smiling in a less off-putting manner. That's about it. I'm going to keep reading, and hopefully this story arc pans out, but let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. As always, if you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you'd hit the like and subscribe button, as well as the notification bell so you never miss out on a new video. Thanks for watching.